Welcome back, MTG Joe here. Today we are back from the holidays. Hope everyone had a great one. We are going to cover the weekly metagame breakdown for the best decks in Standard, best of three, traditional Standard, Standard with a sideboard. We're going to be focusing on Mythic Rank only because it's the last couple days of the month. You want to cruise into a top 1200 finish, try to lock in that 250 just to skip the play-in, or just try to make that last minute push to Mythic. Check out these decks, which are the best highest win rate decks of the week from the ladder. We're getting the data as always from Untapped.gg, companion tool that works with Arena. It tracks your win rates, gives a whole bunch of cool stats, deck collections, gives you suggestions in terms of decks you can win with or just build. I'm a little rusty. We ate too much food the last few days. But I will paste all these deck lists. If you want to use Untapped, link is in the video description. You can find all the details as always in the video description for the respective video. So we will take a look at what is happening today. We're going to look at the popularity of decks, and then we are going to look at the win rates themselves. Last kind of note, so we are just wrapping up the charity drive, probably give it another day or two. So everything that I've earned from YouTube this month, I'm donating to a food bank here in Toronto. So we are getting close to the goal. I want to see how close we can get to it. We're at $649 out of the $800 that we were looking to raise. So I will be making that donation in the coming day or so, which is pretty sweet. I'm glad we could hit those numbers. So let's jump in. Dimir Midrange, most played deck, 12%. We have Gruul Prowess at 8%, almost 9%. Domains making a come up at about 8%. Mono Red Aggro 7%. Golgari Midrange, it's 6.6%, but nothing had like a plus 55% win rate. Honestly, nothing had like over 53%, so we're not gonna include it in today's video. The Beanstalk deck had a good showing. It's at 4.2%. The Azorius Artifact deck, the Glyph decks, those decks have fallen off in terms of win rate. It was at 50%, so we won't be covering it. Similarly, Mono White Control was sub 50%. It was like 46%. We're not going to be covering it today. I do want to kind of highlight at the end, we'll probably pull up some lists for Jeskai Convoke. It wasn't in kind of the data dump of like decks being played right now. Might just be smaller volume of games. But I'm going to be playing in a trios team event where I'm in the standard seat, and I will likely be playing Jeskai Convoke just based on my collection with my buddies, since I'm lending out my Pioneer Red deck to my friend. So got to figure out how to navigate this deck to an efficient state to try to get that RCQ win. But let's jump into it, folks. So we're going to look at 16,000 games played from December 20th through the 27th. A little bit slower week, all things considered, with the holidays. I know I haven't been playing that much recently. But jumping in, Domain takes the top spot, 71%. This is the Zur Overlord with a couple changes along the way. We see the the Eternal Emperor, just kind of a board wipe-esque effect. The blink effect works really nice with the Overlords. While it doesn't work with their impending, you can, if they are creatures, you can blink them to get that extra value, and then just making creatures to kind of gum up the board. Zur animates any of your Overlords, even if they're impending, so you get the attack trigger. This version here is a little bit lighter on sweepers. We've previously seen upwards of 4 Sunfalls. This version is only on 2, splitting it with Temporary Lockdown, and then just playing a little bit more early interaction. We have the Get Lost, Not on My Watch in the main board, kind of a concession to the aggro decks. Card you don't see too often in these lists is Wrenn and Realm Breaker. So this does fix your mana. Now notably, this just makes your lands tap for 1 of any mana. It does not create basically like an everywhere token for your lands where they are all the domain types, so you don't get the discount for Leyline Binding. So keep that in mind. But you can animate lands with this. You can mill, find permanents, and then you get an emblem to kind of rebuy stuff from your graveyard. Cool card here is Scroll Shift. So it could be as a temporary fog style effect for one of, say, your opponent's big creatures. If they go in on like a Heartfire hero, you can kind of reset it that way there. It cycles, but you can also just blink your impending Overlords to surprise block out of nowhere. We have Elspeth Smite for aggressive decks, but Doppelgang for mid-range kind of domain mirrors. Negate is cheap counter. Not on My Watch, more cheap removal. Paw Patch Formation, any kind of Demons deck, anything with flyers, good against like Atraxas, good against any enchantment heavy decks. Rest in peace for the graveyard synergy. Scroll Shift again, just kind of value engine, and temporary lockdown for the aggressive decks. We have Temur Otters, next highest deck, 71%. This deck here, basically the combination of Enduring Vitality and Valley Floodcaller lets you tap and untap creatures for mana. The Vitality lets them tap for mana. Valley Floodcaller untaps them when you cast a non-creature spell. And in this case here, kind of gives them pseudo prowess with the abilities. So you can do things with like Storm Chaser's Talent, tapping the creatures, get mana, you up the beans, or this town ain't big enough, bounce back your own stuff, and then reset this. So you could go to chapter 2, get back to this town ain't big enough, bring Storm Chaser's Talent back to hand, and kind of generate mana that way. You have early effects that find lands that later have utility. Song of Tokuzen is a kind of mana sink that can give you rats that also tap for mana. Torch is cheap removal. Thunder Trap Trainer helps you find stuff, and then afterwards gets you a creature to tap. You have Invasion of Ixalan here as a way to kind of have a permanent that helps you find other stuff, and then you can bounce it back to hand for value. Jace Reawaken is a card you don't really see in these decks that often. Just draw, discard, help you kind of filter, lets you plot something. So you can maybe plot Valley Floodcaller, get that value. Notably, this cannot be played in the first 3 turns of the game. Then you have Roaring Furnace as removal that can be bounced back to hand. Lithomantic Barrage, very good against like the Simic Terror decks. Any blue or white decks. Negate cheap counters, Paw Patch like we mentioned, Pyroclasm for the aggressive decks, Convoke, stuff like that. Scorching Dragonfire as cheap removal that exiles. You have, did they mismatch the arts? I was wondering if they mismatched the arts. Up the Beanstalk, we have, for like the Grandier matchups, Dream Dew Entrancer, just as a way for like card advantage in the mid-rangey mirrors. You can tap one of your creatures, and then you get around it by having it, like Valley Floodcaller can eventually get stun counters off, or you can slow down your opponent, put a stun counter, kind of go from there. Ral for the Grandier matchups, with Stalker Frenzy for bigger removal. Simic Beanstalk, Simic Terror, whatever you want to call it. So this deck here, it's base Simic in the main board, and then you have some black lands with Gloom Lake Verge, as well as a swamp in the sideboard for removal in the sideboard. This deck is looking to put spells into your graveyard, and then get a reduced cost Tolarian Terror or Eddie Mark Crab. This town ain't big enough. All cards that have, they're basically 5 CMC or greater to trigger Beanstalk, but don't actually cost 5. So you kind of get that value. You can do the Storm Chaser's Talent, this town ain't big enough kind of combo as well, kind of loop those effects. But you get these big ones, chain together, draw you a bunch of cards, smack down that way there. Ghost Vacuum as Graveyard Hate. You have Minor Misstep as a cheap counter for like the aggressive decks. Pick your poison. Another kind of like Paw Patch Formation-esque effect. Herbology Instructor for the aggressive decks gains you life. You could bounce it back to hand with this town ain't big enough to keep gaining you life that way there. Cheap counters, Nowhere to Run is cheap removal. The Swamp also helps with Terra Sunder to give you the kicker effect. Now with this one here, note that Bushwhack lets you find the swamp. So while you're just playing one swamp, it's pseudo tutorable with that, or Cash Grab can help you dig for it as well. Gruul Prowess, 69 nice %. So this deck here, basically an adaptation of the mono red deck, just getting a little bit more grind elements with some sideboard cards. Innkeeper's Talent is a way to repeatedly trigger the Valiant ability on your mice. It gives some pseudo protection and just makes really large creatures. You have Questing Druid for card advantage as well. Kind of the core of the deck for the mono red deck we see. And then we see Torch the Tower as cheap removal. One thing you'll sometimes see with these decks is they'll play Paw Patch Recruit, the 1-mana 2/1 Offspring, in lieu of Hired Claw. Reason being, it plays better into the black base decks. It could give you 2 bodies instead of 1. And it makes the targeted removal kind of awkward because you get to put counters, and it could potentially help you dodge a cut down in that case. So something to kind of keep in mind there. Restless Ridgeline in the mana base, as well as some of the Verges. Lithomantic Barrage, cheap removal. Torch, again, just exile removal, comes at a premium with things like Heartfire Hero, the Curiosities, stuff like that. Glittering Bolt, exile cheap removal. Paw Patch, So big thing with this deck versus the mono red deck, you have more outs to things like demons, so like 6/6s, enchantments, stuff like that, where the mono red deck, if they slam down, you know, Archfiend Adross, you're usually having to spend multiple spells and 2-for-1ing yourself to get it off the board. Druid for the grindier matchups, Scorching Shot for cheap removal, and Urbrass Forge for the grind matchups. Mardu, really Boros aggro, so this is just kind of a Auras deck with access to the Fling. So you have Sheltered by Ghosts, Shardmage Rescue, a couple Optimistic Scavengers to distribute counters, Ethereal Armor makes things really big, Demonic Ruckus, you have your, not the full mouse package, so not the double strike in this one, just Emberheart Challenger, opting to go with Slick Shot instead. Burst Lightning is cheap removal, this can be Torch the Tower as well, Barrage, Get Lost flexible against heavy black-based decks. A lot of these decks are adopting Knight of Grace with Hexproof from black. It makes their cut downs and targeted removals pretty bad, so you could just go all in and then not have to worry about targeted removal there. Graveyard Hate, case of the Crimson Pulse for some of the grindier matchups, as well as Urbrass Forge. If they're showing something like Authority of the Consoles, Forge gets much, much worse in those matchups, so Case provides some utility there. Next up, we have Dimir Midrange, 66%. So this deck here is kind of built around the engine of Enduring Curiosity, drawing you a whole bunch of cards. These decks have been adapting some numbers of Feybloom Trick. 3 mana to create 2 1/1 fairies with flying, and then you get to tap target creature your opponent controls. So this provides you a number of blockers for the mirror, since a lot of the creatures are X1s. As well, you could tap down a big creature out of, say, mono red. It gives you multiple ways to draw cards out of Curiosity. It gives you multiple ways to kind of ninjutsu out Kaido. So a lot of kind of engine there. Flood Pit Drowner kind of replaced Deep Cavern Bat in these lists, just very tempo oriented. Spell Stutters, cheap counters, a bunch of cheap removal mixed in with like your top end of just very powerful 4-drops. And then Soulstone Sanctuary is a ninja, so it does work with Kaido. It's also a fairy, so it works with Spell Stutter. All kind of sweet little micro synergies. Cheap removal, hand hate, counters for kind of the mid-rangey matchups. Exile, cheap removal, cheap counters, blot out for big things, Malicious Eclipse for the go wide aggro decks. Preacher, just it could stonewall a lot of the aggressive decks, helps kind of stabilize your board. You have Gix Command as a sweeper, Shieldred kind of for the mid-range mirrors. Could also be reasonable against aggro decks. Mono red aggro, so nothing really changed with this list week over week in the main board. Just your Screaming Nemesis with the mouse package, bunch of cheap burn kind of complementing it. Torch the Tower, full of 4 of, Obliterating Bolt. Now, one thing with Torch, it's harder in this deck to get the bargain. You don't have a lot of cheap artifacts or kind of cheap fodder for it to bargain. A copy of Scorching Dragonfire might not be terrible. In lieu, Lithomantic Barrage is also something I wouldn't be against if the Simic Terror deck would be kind of present. So I would maybe cut like a Witchstalker Frenzy, cut a Scorching Dragon, or Torch the Dragon, Torch the Tower, and play like a 2 Barrages maybe in there. This list is starting to go with upwards of 3 Sunspine Links in the side for the grindy, or like the greedier mana bases. Helps you play around temporary lockdown, stuff like that. It gives you another way to kind of shut off life gain from the big decks. And then Forge. Gruul Delirium. So this is the other deck I was considering for the RCQ, but I don't want to buy Wrens because they're like $40 for a playset and they don't really see play elsewhere. But this deck here, looking to enable Delirium. So you have a bunch of creatures that are multiple types. Fear of Missing Out. You have Wildfire Wickerfolk, you have Patchwork Beastie, all kind of multi types, artifacts, enchantment set. You can get extra combats with Fear of Missing Out. You have Ren the Realmbreaker, which animates a land. If you animate Restless Ridgeline, you get its ability, which is really sweet. And then Violent Urge gets you double strike out of nowhere, and then you just kind of chunk in a whole bunch of damage. The nice thing about this deck is it dodges at times a lot of the common removal. Dodges cut down, dodges go for the throat, dodges go for the throat, dodges cut down. So you have ways to kind of get around some of the common removal types. Burst Lightning, cheap removal, Pick Your Poison, and Paw Patch, just flexible ways to deal with artifacts, enchantments, flyers. Snakeskin for protection against the heavy targeted removal decks. Cheap removal, Pyroclasm for the go wide decks. Untimely Malfunction can get rid of blockers. and then Vengeful Possession for the big stuff. Now, this deck here coming up next, we're going to just feature from one of the community members, but it's a deck that's been doing very well on MTGO. It is the Esper Blue, White, Black Pixie deck. So this one's 8-0 by name I can't pronounce. So the core of the deck is a Stormchaser's Talent. This town ain't big enough, but you're basically just bouncing and getting value out of your enchantments, stuff like that. So Fear of Isolation has an additional cost that you have to return a permanent you control to its owner's hand. So you could return things like Hopeless Nightmare, the token from Spiteful Hexmage. You can reset your Stormchaser's Talent. You can reset your Sheltered by Ghost in a pinch. Nowhere to Run comes back and you get to rebuy it. Shard's Maze Rescue to kind of rebuy the protection effect. When the enchantments come to play, Optimistic Scavenger makes things bigger. You have Nurturing Pixie that could also rebuy stuff. So it's kind of just a tempo value engine style deck. Destroy Evil is cheap removal. No More Lies as counters. You could play Negate as well. I would probably play Negate because the thing is, No More Lies has a shelf life. You usually want this in like the sweeper deck, stuff like that. But Domain in those decks can kind of get ahead on mana where this is less useful. I would probably play Negate. Nowhere to Run, cheap removal. Full 4 Rest in Peace might seem a little bit high. You could probably just play like a third Negate. And then Shrouded Shepherd, mainly for the creatures opponent control get -1/1. One-sided Sweeper, that works as a creature as well. You can rebuy it to hand, so you could get some value there as a returnable Sweeper effect. And then Lorn as a kind of artifact enchantment hate. There's also this deck here. So this is the Collector's Cage deck. This one's from Mike 4, 18 and 6, but there's a lot of versions of this deck. The one thing I'll say is this particular variant, don't play Overrun. It's not that good. You're not going to want to play like a 5 mana spell. I would probably just play more Virtues, similar with like Seraphic Seed. Again, just play, I would trim these, play the full Virtues, and then play the full Sheltered by Ghosts, even if you want to split, but kind of gives you an idea of like what the deck's trying to do. You make a bunch of tokens, a bunch of ways to make tokens. Enduring Innocence should be a 4 of in this deck as well. So there's little things we can tweak. I'm going to modify it a bit in the deck dump in terms of things you could bring in. But Sky Knight's Wire gets really big with all the kind of various things. Collector's Cage can cheat out Overlord, put counters on things, kind of value engine. Sandstorm Salvager puts counters on things as well. Break the Spell, destroys enchantments. Elspeth Smite, you could probably just play like Pot Patch Formation in lieu of this. Rest in Peace for Graveyard Hate, more Sheltered for the red-based aggro, Aven Interrupter for sweeper decks, Beza for kind of the mid-range grind piles. And then the last one I did want to take a look at was just seeing which variant of Jeskai could be doing best. So if we're looking for November now, so this way it's a little bit bigger of a range. In Mythic Rank, so the 2 Spyglass Siren, it seems to be doing the best, or not Spyglass, 2 Mockingbird version, 1 Painter's Studio. So I've been playing the version that's just been full 4 Sheltered, 2 Gateway, so kind of something like this, with like the full Mockingbirds. The one thing I haven't liked is you lose out on some elements in the sideboard of having a way to put pressure that doesn't force you to commit more to the board. So just kind of looking, this is like the variant I've been playing in a way. But I've liked that one's at 53. So Yodian. So the nice thing about Painter's Studio here, Deface Gallery gives your creatures a bonus. Whereas like you kind of are with Case, you need creatures to solve it, but you also don't want to play it too early because it is one of your few sources of removal. The interesting thing with this deck here is access to Split Up as a one-sided sweeper. I've loved Protect the Negotiators as a card that is playing against like the domain decks, the control decks, just giving you that counterspell style effect that can also put pressure on the board. So I have liked that. So there's kind of some ideas here. I'll probably play a couple different versions then share, but If anybody has a solid Jeskai Convoke list that they're liking, there's a lot of tweaks along the edges in terms of decks like this. In any case, thank you for watching. Hope you have a great one. Stay safe out there, and we'll catch you next time.